All right, good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Well, I am just here to welcome you all to our second input session for our BEAD Initial Proposal Volume 2. Just a reminder, and I know the team will share that momentarily, the official period for the public comment closes on September 19th. And so we'll be accepting comments, of course, through this presentation this morning. And we'll also be accepting written comments through September 19th. And so you'll have all that information at the end of this morning's presentation. And again, just welcome you all. We look forward to having great dialogue this morning. And I know Chandler and Cole will go through some housekeeping rules for this morning's presentation. And with that, I'll just go over the agenda real quickly. We're going to talk about the BEAD 5-year goals and objectives, also how to read volume 2 and what we can and cannot control through the program, the subgrantee selection and evaluation criteria, BEAD requirements for all subgrantees, low-cost service option and middle-class affordability, and the final discussion will be around opportunities for non-deployment. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to the team. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Cole McAndrew, Policy Analyst in the Broadband Office. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the BEAD program before I pass it off to Chandler to go into some of the more technical details. So for those of you who aren't aware, I hope you are if you're here, but the Broadband Equity Access Deployment Program is what we're here to discuss. And so this is a program that was created by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in 2021, allocated $42.45 billion. Can I get confirmation really quick that you guys can hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Yep. Okay, sorry, everything was frozen on my side. So the BEAD program was created from Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, $42 billion to provide states funds to address the infrastructure element of the digital divide and provide service to all unserved and unserved locations in their state. For Virginia, it's an opportunity to expand on the progress made under the VADI program and then to move into affordability and adoption programs and non-deployment programs, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And our allocation from the BEAD program, which is determined by a formula, is $1.48 billion. So on the next slide, I will go through the stages of the BEAD program. And so the 5-year plan is the first part of the BEAD program, and it's really just sort of broadly the state is required to discuss their strategy for utilizing BEAD funds in concert with other funds, and then generally discuss your strategy to close or mitigate or minimize the digital divide in your state. So sort of discussing alignment between infrastructure and then affordability and adoption or digital opportunity. Beyond the 5-year plan, which we have posted, it's on our website. Encourage you all to go check that out. Are the initial proposal documents. So these are 2 volumes of policy documents that require the state to discuss how they plan to manage and award BEAD funds to applicants. Our volume 1 is completed and submitted to NTIA, the federal agency that administers these grants. And we're here today to discuss volume 2. So following the initial proposals, the final proposal is where you explain to NTIA that you've reviewed applications, you've gone through a challenge process, and that is a big policy document that really unleashes the money for you to use. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll discuss a lot of text on this slide, but I'll go through it quickly. But the order of priority with BEAD funds is prescribed in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. There's really a hierarchy to how these funds are required to be used. And the number 1 priority for the BEAD program and for us is to reach all unserved locations and then underserved. But the main priority, and I'll talk about how we combine these on the next slide, but the main priority is to use BEAD funds to finish allocating funds to close the infrastructure divide in Virginia. So connecting all unserved and underserved, 2 different definitions, which we'll get to in the BEAD program. Following that, you can move to, if funding is available, you can move to affordability and adoption programs, what's called non-deployment. in the BEAD program. So affordability and adoption, and then some other things like telehealth, smart agriculture. So that's for us. We've identified 162,000 locations as unserved and not in a funded project area. This is expected to come down through the challenge process, which we anticipate occurring from September to December. This process is really important for reaching universal access in the Commonwealth because we want to make sure that we identify all the locations that are eligible for BEAD funding so that we can approve a project to get to them. And then we've estimated $950 million in state build costs for 162,000 unserved locations. We can go to the next slide, my last before I pass it back to Chandler, but this is the mandated priority for states and territories with BEAD funds. So I talked about our priority being finishing the infrastructure divide in Virginia. So that's in the BEAD program as being the number 1 and 2 priorities is unserved and underserved locations. So unserved are those that lack 25.3, and then underserved those that lack 100 over 20 megabits speed internet. Third, as you can imagine, you'd want to support workforce development concurrent to infrastructure deployment. So the third is supporting workforce development just to meet the workforce needs to keep expanding the infrastructure. Fourth, connecting community anchor institutions, which have a higher speed classification in the BEAD program, gigabit symmetrical speeds. So community anchor institutions that don't have gigabit symmetrical speeds are eligible for BEAD funds. And then finally, once you've finished allocating funds for infrastructure and supported workforce development, you can look to non-deployment programs, which I'll talk about again at the end. But again, these are things like broadly in the affordability and adoption category. So with that, go back to Chandler to discuss some of our goals.
It's Cole. Good to be with everybody. Thanks for the folks that are subjecting themselves to this presentation twice now. Good to have you back today, in addition to last Thursday. Chandler Vaughn, I work as a senior policy analyst in the broadband office. Last Friday, hopefully a lot of you saw that Governor Youngkin put out a press release announcing our 5-year plan and publication of Volume 2, recognizing we were the first state in the nation to do so. If you haven't had a chance to read that release or stuff that was written about it, I'd encourage you to go back, check it out. There was an article run in VPAP through the Richmond Times this morning. And just want to recognize that achievement. So the 5-year plan is really the document that outlines the goals and what's been covered over the last few days. But we have the goal of investing BEAD funding, not building out networks. That's the second bullet, but investing all BEAD funding to those remaining 162,000 locations, and that's with an asterisk. We expect that number to come down through the challenge process later on this year. But invest funding to achieve universal coverage to all unserved and underserved locations by the end of the next calendar year. We expect the BEAD process, which we outline in Volume 2, to put us in the position to make those awards certainly by the end of next calendar year. The goal would be to complete the construction of those projects within the federally allowed timeline of 4 years after announcement of awards. Of course, we're going to work to accelerate construction, as you'll see in that objective bullet below the goal, but the federally allowed timeline for the construction of BEAD projects is 4 years in length. So accordingly, that goal is set for completion of construction by the end of 2028. The BEAD program, again, because we're in a position in Virginia having made a good amount of investments in broadband deployment, we also believe we may be in the position to address broadband affordability and adoption needs. So you'll see goals and narratives of that set in the 5-year plan as well. The first is to increase the Affordable Connectivity Program utilization by more than 5%. We're working on that now through a Federal Communications Commission ACP outreach grant that our office was awarded. And then we're also working to develop smart programs around broadband adoption. And Cole's going to talk more about that later on, about how we're thinking through setting up long-term and impactful broadband adoption programs in the Commonwealth. So getting into the nitty-gritty of Volume 2, we want to start off by really building context around everything in terms of a map. For folks that are familiar with our programs, we've been working now in about 80 cities and counties across the Commonwealth. And a lot of maps of those counties and cities look like this. This is Goochland County, where you'll see we've got VOTI investments in blue dots, overlapping some with accelerating RDOF awarded areas, and there's also some USDA funding in there as well. I'll note that we did not map CAF 2 on here. There is some CAF 2 in Goochland County, but the way the BEAD process works and the way the challenge process will work starting in what we hope is October, we will publish a list of these locations that are unserved and underserved. That will be released for a public comment period. Folks can challenge. Eligible challengers or local governments, broadband providers, and nonprofits can claim that areas are either unserved or underserved, or they are in fact actually served when we have them listed otherwise. Those contents in that outline was provided in Volume 1, but we're showing this map as a reference point for what to expect under the BEAD program. Our office went through a pretty intense challenge process of the FCC broadband maps, and this is the result. A lot of unserved locations that are maybe in nooks and crannies of areas or back roads where it was previously assumed that they were in fact served. So we'll be releasing that list of locations as soon as we can. We're waiting on federal permission. Those shape files of at least our starting point of those 162,000 locations before the challenge process. But just wanted to provide this as context for folks that even in areas there were county-wide broadband projects, there still could be hundreds of unserved locations, and our office and planners will be there to help counties navigate that process in terms of how to think about BEAD that we'll cover on the next few slides as well. The primary point of confusion for BEAD we found so far is what state broadband offices have control over versus what is being encouraged or even mandated by NTIA. And just to spell out the acronym, National Telecommunications and Information Administration. It's a federal entity that administers the BEAD program. We've broken it down based on some webinars put out by US Telecom, and it breaks down what are completely mandatory requirements of BEAD, what's mandatory with some discretion, and then what's completely discretionary. So we'll go through these slides and, again, cover these later on as well in the presentation. But you can see here how each one of those categories breaks out. This doesn't necessarily list every single requirement of the BEAD program. For example, what we'll go through on the next slide are the scoring criteria and grant process design. In my opinion, those are the two areas where state broadband offices have the most flexibility under BEAD. And then everything else is a degree of what NTIA's requirements are and what flexibility we have. So getting into what that grant application process looks like, we're picturing that to take place in two phases. I talked earlier about the challenge process. So assuming we can get the challenge process done this calendar year, maybe going in a little bit into 2024. After that challenge process, we've defined the X number of locations that are unserved and underserved and unserved community anchor institutions. We'll publish that finalized list, and that starts the 60-day window as described under phase 1 for broadband providers to submit shape files and the letter of qualification to our office, noting where that provider is interested in serving locations under the BEAD program. We'll take those shape files from all the different providers, overlap them onto each other, and based on where overlap exists, draw defined application areas for providers to then submit proposals on in phase 2. The reason that is because there's a federal requirement in the Notice of Funding Opportunity for broadband offices to develop application areas where we can compare apples to apples solutions. So going back to our Goochland County example, if we have provider A bidding on a collection of 500 locations and provider B bidding on another collection of 500 locations with some overlap, we can't compare those two proposals on an apples to apples basis. We've got a section off where there's only one bidder or one proposer under phase 1. And then where there's overlap between those two proposals, then where there's also the only other singularly proposed area. It's our way of trying to help design application areas that make the most sense for the private sector and for all broadband providers without just locking folks into what has historically been census blocks or another unit of geography. The full application phase will be a 90-day period for providers to submit all the information that's needed, and we'll describe on forthcoming slides. We're working on a way, and we'll describe this later too, about a standardized application and then collecting information that's needed per application area. Once we've collected those applications, we'll go through a review process in our office. The stages of award here are a little bit different than what we're used to in the VADI process. For VADI, we make recommendations to the governor's office. The governor's office then announces the awards. Under BEAD, we make recommendations to the governor's office. The governor's office then makes recommendations accordingly to NTIA. Once that process is approved, then we can announce those awards for publication. The other thing we have flexibility on for state broadband offices are the scoring criteria for BEAD. Now, I say flexibility with an asterisk. We have to devote 75% of our total points across 3 criteria. You'll see those listed at the top. Minimal BEAD program outlay, that's state cost per pass or cost efficiency. The next scoring criteria is the affordability. We are required to score that based on the pricing of the gigabit symmetrical package offered in the project area. And lastly is fair labor practices. You'll see the according percentages there next to those 3 areas that add up to 75%. We've got flexibility again with an asterisk on 25% of the remaining scoring criteria. So speed to deployment, we're proposing to give 5% to that category. And then on our fully optional 20%, we're proposing to do 2 things to, again, carry the spirit of the VADI program over into BEAD. 10 points would be for a broadband provider consulting a local government in the process of proposing to serve a location or collection of locations under the BEAD program. The second 10-point bucket there would be if the local government has issued a letter of support for that broadband provider. And that could be for one provider, it could be for multiple, even in the same proposal area or application area. Glad to elaborate on that when we get to the end for Q&A. There's also some points here that we want to touch on, maybe questions we didn't get to in the last few slides. There's a lot of questions about how much can BEAD pay per location for fiber connectivity. We covered earlier that BEAD is a fiber first program, and then if we don't receive a proposal to serve locations with fiber, then we can move on to other solutions. But the maximum we'll pay for a location to be served is what's called in the BEAD Notice of Funding Opportunity as the extremely high cost threshold. We are planning on setting that after we receive applications. It gives us the ability to see where it might be the most appropriate threshold to set based on proposals we guide in across the state to make that most informed decision. The second question there, what if we don't receive a proposal to serve an area under BEAD? We can either one, move on to look at whatever solution that was submitted for that area that's not fiber optics, or we can also engage with broadband providers directly if nobody included that in their phase 1 application area. We covered this earlier as well, but the federal timeline to build out a BEAD project is 4 years from the announcement of the award. Just flagging for folks that is different from the VADI state general fund process now of the time or the clock starting to tick once we sign a contract. Under BEAD, it's from the time when the award is actually announced. So your environmental review or historical preservation review is counting against that 4-year timeline under the BEAD program. The last question there, do providers, and this was spoken to a little bit earlier, where we're trying to streamline the application process where providers can submit all the standardized information that's required under BEAD in one long application. And then we'll develop a form that's required for folks to use to submit information that's needed for each application area. So what's your total dollar amount requested? Have you gained the county's support? Have you met with that county or city? Yeah, so I think now would be a good time to stop for Bill. You want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question?
So, Chandler, first of all, good morning, everybody. A lot of our areas are covered by provider franchise agreements. So a lot of times I don't think you're going to get multiple providers in one area. The twist to that is now Glow Fiber if you will, is a lot of areas is offering just internet service. So they don't go with the franchise. But if you receive competing bids, if you will, from two different providers, would you consider the lowest bid of what you would look at doing? Because we're at a point in Roanoke where the cost per passing is really staggering, and it's just covering maybe 1 to 5 passings. From what I see, that's probably going to fall into the BEAD program. And so how is that going to play into this?
Well, Bill, I'll start by saying that the BEAD notice of funding opportunity nor our volume 2 speaks to anything about franchise agreements. So the idea that franchise agreements would affect anybody's strategy under the BEAD program, I think that would not play a factor, right? A provider can come in and propose to serve locations that within an existing service territory of another internet service provider, just like a provider can go and propose to serve unserved locations. So that will be open for applications and proposals once we publish that final list of locations after the challenge process. I would say as a county, stay engaged with providers. If you're planning on coming in for the VADI process this year for state general funds, make sure that you're also having a dialogue with that provider under the BEAD program to make sure they're including the same locations. Also take a look at the list of unserved locations we publish under the BEAD process to make sure those are in any kind of VADI state general fund proposals. I think that's the broad advice we'd have there. And I did see Cole's message in the chat about waiting for questions at the end. Just to play both sides of that, we'll take folks that have a hand up now and then wait until we get to the second half of the presentation later to take questions. With that, Evan, go ahead.
I'll just wait till the end of the presentation and follow Cole's direction.
That sounds good. Just keep the hand up so we can make sure you're first in line at the end. So now to get into the requirements of all subgrantees, this is the components of what we were describing earlier, is that long form application for all providers to submit regardless of how many application areas you're proposing to serve under BEAD. We won't go through all of these, but a lot of things you'll find familiar through VADI state general funds, but also you'll see some new things in here as well. So I'll go through here and try to point out new areas. The letter of credit requirement for providers. You'll see familiar things on here of managerial capabilities, technological capabilities that are similarly asked under the VADI process. Network ownership requirements, providers should read into the federal requirements outlined there. Operational capabilities are similar to what you find under the existing VADI process now. More here for folks that see the baby Davis-Bacon requirements. That's garnered a lot of attention so far. You'll see that those are similar to the requirements under the American Rescue Plan, but there are also proposed to be some additional questions there beyond what ARPA required. So I'd encourage you to go read into Volume 2 and what's in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is a verbatim copy and paste over from one to the other. And then lastly here, cybersecurity and supply chain risk management are two new things that we've not formally incorporated into the VADI process. We've always asked, or at least recently have asked, about what our providers' efforts are to mitigate any kind of supply chain and workforce delays. But the BEAD program takes that a step further. So we're requesting information based on those NIST frameworks and NIST regulation citations there on that slide. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Cole to talk low-cost plan and middle-class affordability.
Thanks, Chandler. We can go ahead to the next slide. So as Chandler said, I'm going to discuss our proposed low-cost service option and then our middle-class affordability plan. Again, these are both proposed for public comment, and we will take questions at the end. So just to start with our low-cost service option, and this is a required element, again, of the BEAD program. We are required to propose a definition of a low-cost service option that applicants in the BEAD program or awardees in the BEAD program must offer. And so the low-cost service option, our definition for it, Couple major criteria: costs $30 a month, inclusive of all fees, taxes, and charges billed to the customer. Allows the end user to apply for the ACP and Lifeline subsidies, and then makes an effort to inform them of those programs. Consistently provides speeds of 100/20, latency measurements of no more than 100 milliseconds, and then does not subject the customer to data caps, surcharges, usage-based throttling, and then the use policies are the same for all subscribers. In the event the applicant offers a low-cost plan with higher speeds in the future, permits the eligible subscriber that's subscribed to the low-cost service option to then upgrade to the better plan. You'll see if you look at the notice of funding opportunity that our definition here of our low-cost service option pretty closely mirrors the proposed definition that NTIA has given states in the notice of funding opportunity. So if we go to the next slide, there's a couple more elements to this plan or this service option. The applicant or awardee in the BEAD program is required to participate in the ACP, and then in the event that the ACP program ceases to exist and there's some sort of subsequent newer program or replacement program, the provider will participate in that as well. So the low-cost service option, major caveat to it is that it is eligibility restricted. So it's restricted to subscribers or prospective customers that meet certain eligibility criteria that we propose. And so our definition or set of eligibility criteria just mirror those established by the FCC for the ACP program, meaning that the provider could not establish additional eligibility criteria that are more restrictive than the ACP. The office strongly encourages that it be made available across the subgrantee service territory. However, for the purposes of the BEAD program, it's only required to be offered within awarded project areas. So another part of this plan that we've added on to the NTIA definition is that you can seek a waiver from our office to increase the cost of the plan from $30 to $50 a month, with all of the requirements I just discussed held constant, with that transition. If you demonstrate to us that the ISP is incapable of offering $30 a month package, is cost prohibitive or not reasonably possible. So we'll evaluate these waivers on a case-by-case basis and reserve the right to decline if it's not clearly demonstrated that this need is necessary. So moving on to the next slide, the middle class affordability plan. So the BEAD program requires that the state demonstrate a plan to further the affordability of the broadband services for the middle class. Our proposed middle class affordability plan is two main elements. First, as Chandler mentioned earlier, we're scoring affordability in the application review process. So that's a major component of our plan of how we're furthering the affordability of these services that we're scoring. Is 20% of the total scoring criteria are how affordable your gigabit symmetrical service package is relative to other applicants. And if you're under $100, you get the full points for this. But that's a major part of our middle class affordability plan because ultimately that is a sizable amount of the scoring criteria. The second part, the second proposed element of the middle class affordability plan is the recommended service option. So again, recommended. This is just us recommending a service option that we think would be affordable to the middle class. It's not a requirement that awardees offer this service option, but just to go over that service option, the recommended service option, it has the same criteria for the most part as the low-cost service option, but it's started at $50 a month, and then it's not eligibility restricted. But our recommendation is that providers adopt a service option that meets the criteria for the low-cost service option and is available to the general public or to all prospective customers. So moving on, and I know that was a lot. Like I said, we'll take questions at the end. So moving on to non-deployment. we can just go to the next slide there. Yeah. So mentioned this earlier, but just to go over it again, the BEAD program prioritizes extending service to unserved and underserved locations, community anchor institutions, supporting workforce development. But once you've done all that, if you have funds left over, you can then consider non-deployment. So this is, we refer to it a lot as affordability adoption or digital opportunity. Non-deployment is just things that address the digital divide outside of infrastructure, for sort of a loose, easier way to put it, I guess. This list is sort of a guide list offered by NTIA of things the office or the state can consider to support under non-deployment. It's not an exhaustive list. Non-deployment is a pretty new area, so that there are things that maybe haven't even been thought of yet or discovered that could be funded with non-deployment. But as you can see here, a lot of the things that get tossed around a lot in affordability and adoption conversations, cybersecurity training, telehealth, digital literacy, digital navigators, smart agriculture, broadband adoption initiatives more broadly, and then other activities sort of opening the door to other things that we haven't yet sort of discovered. So moving on to the next slide, if you've read volume 2, you probably found that we go over a sort of broad but purposeful overview of our priorities for non-deployment and how we're going to approach the design of non-deployment programs in our final proposal, which is where we'll go into a lot more depth on non-deployment programs with BEAD funds. So really critical for us are these 4 items. First, that it generates a return for the Commonwealth and its residents. So we want the BEAD funds to have an impact that lasts beyond just the folks that immediately are affected by the funds. We want it to have a generational impact, and address the digital divide in a sustainable manner, not a one-time exhaustion of funds. And we wanted to address a component of the digital divide that's been identified. The digital opportunity plan and the digital opportunity survey we have out in the field will be critical for this, letting us see what the digital divide actually looks like. It should be an innovative solution, and then we want the key factor in mind is the capacity and experience of organizations that we work with non-deployment. We want them to actually have the capacity to manage what could be large programs, and then have experience managing similar programs or the scale necessary to accommodate new programs. So with that, we'll move on to the question and answer period. I can hand it back to Chandler to MC that, and I think Evan's up first.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's start with Evan. And for other folks, I think it helps the most if you can raise your hand in teams. But we'll make a clear opportunity for folks that maybe can't do that or are calling in on the phone. So Evan, we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I just want to, first of all, Chandler, thank you and your office for everything you've done. You guys have been just really responsive and supporting us. I'm up in Fairfax, so I just a question about the predetermined sites already. If you kind of look at the map for Fairfax, I think we've had this discussion with Cole already. It kind of shows that it's 100% connected, but our challenge is we have some of our older affordable dwelling units that necessarily don't have the infrastructure. So my question is, if you already are predetermining sites of where that initial money is going to go, how does a place like Fairfax factor in if you're looking at those maps already, and we already know there's some inconsistencies there? How do we handle something like that if it's already predetermined where that first initial phase of money is going to go? That's my first question, and then I have one or two more after that.
Okay, let's take this first one then. It's a good question. It was the subject too of volume 1 of the BEAD initial proposal. So like Cole was saying earlier, we've got a list of 162,000 locations that we will publish this month, hopefully earlier if we can get federal permission to do so. When we when we submit volume 2 and have full approval on volume 1, that starts our challenge process. And that's what you guys would be involved in for this purpose. There's likely going to be a couple hundred unserved or underserved locations in Fairfax to begin with. But if you guys believe there's more or less as a county or as a local government, you guys can submit a challenge to do so. I'll happy to schedule a follow-up call to go through what the contents of volume 1 are, and can also go over it too once NTIA approves our final draft of volume 1. But you guys want to be heavily involved there, and any locations that you believe are unserved or underserved, you'd submit a challenge to classify them as that.
That's great. And then I think my other just question is, at some point, are you all going to do any type of in-service around just how to make a challenge? I know you all have given a lot of really good guidance, and I'm just hoping we can lean in a little bit more on that, and just kind of hoping that there'll come a point where there'll be an in-service around that, or some guidance, technical support or training around that.
Definitely. We've in the past, those have always been structured as how to apply webinars when we open up an application window. I think this will be a how to challenge or how to submit a rebuttal webinar around the start of October. We're in the process of scheduling that now.
And then just my last question is just around the affordability piece that Chandler talked about. If you're applying for that, must it be tied to broadband, or can you just apply for affordability funds based on that last criteria that he had kind of talked about?
Cole, I'll turn it over to you for that one.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. I mean, some probably important clarification here. So the non-deployment part of the BEAD program, affordability and adoption are kind of, you can think of them as like the broad categories under which the non-deployment programs, the BEAD funds will fall under. And so should the office stand up programs to address the affordability of broadband services, then there would be either a subgrantee selection part of that, or there would be some sort of program. And we don't have the guidelines for that yet, but those details will really be where the final proposal and our digital opportunity plan, which you've been involved with, those will both be really important for sort of setting our expectations for how we'll go about that process.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate both of you.
Bill, go ahead.
So I have similar concerns to Fairfax, but my problem is I'm in year 5 of doing this, and I still don't know where all I don't have coverage. We're getting ready to commission 100% survey of the county to address where the pockets are, but mine are all going to be in onesie twosie, and I'm almost afraid if I don't get this survey going, I'm going to miss the boat on getting in there. Or if I come up and you show that I'm 100% covered, how I'm going to prove I'm not?
It's a good question and a wise concern. And I don't want to give a comprehensive history of broadband mapping, because I know that a lot of folks on the call are familiar with that. But this is the BEAD effort for mapping unserved and underserved areas is the first time there has ever been a location level analysis statewide of finding unserved and underserved locations. It started back when providers submitted service territory data under the new FCC broadband mapping process. There's the old form 477 census block mapping is still out there, but there's also a new form now where broadband availability is displayed at the location level. So our office went through a pretty extensive challenge process there, and as a part of the volume 1 submission, we've taken the results of that challenge process, removed locations that are ineligible because they're already in an existing funded deployment, and then we'll publish that list, the list of 162,000 locations for counties and cities and broadband providers to lean on when they're drawing BEAD applications and determining who to issue letters of support to. In terms of the survey tool that you guys are considering issuing, I would say talk with us first there. I mean, we should. I think that survey could be useful in terms of determining if you want to challenge additional areas as unserved or already served under the BEAD process. But I'd say all areas should lean into this mapping effort that we've done as a starting point going into the BEAD challenge process. Tamara, I see Tamara's raised a hand, and then after that, we'll go to Fred.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Fred. So I'll hurry up so you can ask your question. I will say, just understand, even though that we're going to be publishing this list, which is made up of the FCC data, once we get permission from NTIA, the list will be fluid. And so there will, as Chandler said earlier, there'll be locations that will be determined to be served through a challenge process. And then there'll be locations added through the challenge process as well. And so, of course, we won't get any more money if we identify more locations that are unserved through service reliability, or locations that are just missing from the data set from the FCC. Because of course, I like to say they're building the plane as they're flying it. This is the first iteration of their new map. Well, the second iteration of their first time doing the new map. And so there'll be some margin of error still, but it's a better foundation than we previously had. And again, we won't go through the history of federal data mapping, but it's a good starting point. And so I will encourage all of our government officials and our local folks that are on here and our providers to make sure you take a good read of volume 1, which is still going through the approval process of NTIA, so that you can get an understanding of the challenge process. And we'll do a lot of communication and education around that process. And so while we're here to talk about volume 2, I would say when you get a chance, go back and look at what we put out for volume 1 and start familiarizing yourself with that. And again, schedule time with our team to ask questions individually based on your individual locality. And so, Fred, what's your question?
Yeah, thank you. This is Fred Mawakdieh with Verizon. Thank you for these sessions. They're very informative. Just a clarification question, something you just mentioned earlier on the middle class optional plan, and whether that relates in any way to the 1 gigabit per second affordability scoring criteria. They're listed on the same page in the proposal, and you also address them on the same slide. So are those two related, or is the 1 gigabit per second affordability scoring criteria for all plans unrelated to middle class?
Yeah,
Thank you.
I can take this one, Chandler. So those are both, I mean, you're correct, they're listed together, but the scoring part is just a reference to our scoring criteria, and the recommended service option is separate. But that's the section you're referencing is our middle class affordability plan, which has 2 elements. One is the recommended service option, and the other is a reference to us prioritizing affordability in our scoring criteria, thus furthering, the affordability goals of the program by scoring for the affordability of the gigabit symmetrical package. It's not an additional requirement for a gigabit, an affordable gigabit symmetrical requirement beyond just the scoring criteria. And then again, the service option in the middle class affordability plan is just recommended, not a required service option, and the requirements underneath of that, or the criteria that go along with the recommended service option, because it's recommended and not required, you could a la carte that if you wanted to, or you could adopt none of it. It's totally at your discretion because it's recommended. Really, the middle class affordability plan, and I know this is kind of a confusing concept, is really just us speaking to NTIA that we are prioritizing the affordability of broadband for the middle class, and detailing a plan for how we're accomplishing that with other requirements.
The middle class option, whether it's offered or not, however, does not factor into the scoring score. It's
No, it does not.
Just the $100 for the 1 gigabit per second. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Tom, before we go to you for your question, I'll say maybe as a general disclaimer, as a state broadband office, we have tried to take a very literal interpretation of the notice of funding opportunity. And have sought clarification where we can get it, but are glad to take things back to the well to see if we can get additional clarification or flexibility on scoring criteria. One example is what we just discussed with the affordability section. We sought flexibility to score other packages rather than the gigabit service option. However, we were pointed back to the notice of funding opportunity and politely told that that was the way we are to score the affordability criteria for BEAD proposals. There's the separate requirement to submit a low-cost service option and offer that low-cost service option, but we are or will be scoring the cost of the gigabit symmetrical service package compared to how close you are to $100 on that price point. So Tom, with that, go ahead.
Yeah, this is maybe a more of a long-term view, but Cole, when you were describing a low-cost option for the $30 option, you mentioned the possibility that ACP would at some point come to an end. And I think what you said was that the ISPs who were participating would be required to participate in a successor program, and then your slide said they would be encouraged to participate. So the question is, which is it, and also what would be considered a successor to the ACP as opposed to a separate program that just happens to come later in time?
Yeah, so it's encouraged. It's not required. If I said required, that's a mistake on my end. It's they can't, or they're not requiring that providers participate in programs that don't yet exist. So apologies there if I did say required. It's just encouraged. Was there a second part to your question?
Well, what is it? What is a successive program? Well,
I mean,
it doesn't exist yet, but
it doesn't exist yet. That's just directly from. I mean, again, this is kind of what Chandler mentioned earlier, and a lot of these questions are, you will require this, and then we're writing, we will require this. And so, this is from the notice of funding opportunity. I think it's just NTA, encouraging the participants in the BEAD program participate, because the FCC's ACP program could run out. And in the event that it does, they're just encouraging, and we are through our proposed definition, that providers participate in a successor program, but it's not a requirement. And as of now, there are no successor programs.
And maybe this is a good time for another general disclaimer. I mean, this is an example of where there may need to be forthcoming guidance, right? So our state, as well as one other in the nation, are moving at a pace than what might be faster than NTIA has promulgated guidance on. An example would be the Buy America public comment window that was pushed out, 2 CFR Part 200 public comment window that was pushed out. To the extent that we are required to comply with the final guidance as issued by NTIA there, we will. A similar model would have to be followed under the successor programs for the ACP. Well, it's kind of a wait and see. We sure hope Congress will continue on investing in affordable broadband access, but that remains to be seen into the middle of 2024. So we'll take that as it comes and have the opportunity for folks to weigh in on what should be the next move based on if there's any action there. Bill, go ahead.
It just crossed my mind. Did Congress allocate the entire, was it 42 billion across all 50 states, or is there still some left over?
It's all allocated.
So I see we've got some commentary joining in with us, but that was allocated based on a funding formula announced on June 30th. And the only way that additional funding would be doled out is if a state turned it in. We don't have a heads up that any state's going to turn back the money. So the 1.48 billion that we've been allocated as the Commonwealth of Virginia is what we've got, and we should plan on investing that wisely and with no additional dollars coming under BEAD. We don't seem to have anybody joining us on phone. Anybody else that may not have a hand raised that wants to jump in and ask a question, feel free to also write it out in the chat, whatever is more convenient for you. Last call. Well, with that, we appreciate everybody joining us. This wraps up our BEAD Volume 2 input sessions, but the general offer is out there for folks that want an additional clarification call or want to get together before that public comment window closes on September 19th. Please reach out to our office. The best way to do that is through the broadband email inbox, broadband@dhcd.virginia, spelled out, .gov. Glad to meet with you to the extent the calendar allows before September 19th to clarify what our thought process was behind Volume 2. And we look forward to working with you guys over the next few years to get this built out. I mean, the BEAD program has a lot of promise for the Commonwealth. I think, as you'll read in the press release that was issued by Governor Youngkin last Friday, to finish the job around broadband connectivity and start thinking wisely about affordability and adoption. So looking forward to working with you all on that front. And with that, we'll sign off and hope everybody has a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you. Great job.